Good morning. As he said, I am the indomitable Saundra Anderson. Reverend said sometimes I still think I'm an intern. So, anybody like Disney movies? Besides Brittany and Sharon, they don't count. They don't count. They don't count. What's your favorite Disney movie? You just yell it out. Little Mermaid, Aladdin. I said, y'all love Disney, don't you? Well, my favorite Disney movie is The Lion King, because I ain't heard none of that. Anybody like The Lion King? All right. I mean, the movie just starts off so beautiful, like some great singing. Anybody remember how it started off? See, I was going to ask y'all to do it, but y'all just did it automatically. Let me hear it one more time. Hey, somebody been watching The Lion King. Yeah. See, I was a little worried. And then I saw Brittany Tuesday, and guess what she had on? The Lion King shirt. I told you she's a Disney fanatic. And it said Hakuna Matata. And I said, you know what? I ain't got no words about this sermon because it's destined. It's destined. So I appreciate that. Y'all just, you know what? Just like the movie started off with that, and it meant it was going to be a good movie. Like, after that song, I was like, the end. Like, great. Hopefully this sermon go just like that, all right? So like I said, everything was going great in the movie. You know, we singing and dancing, you know, having a good time until there's one particular scene that just changed the whole trajectory of the movie. Remember the scene where, you know, Scar, like, pushes Mufasa off the cliff? Like, it was the worst scene ever. Like, for me, this movie came out when I was 8 years old. So, like, it was the first time that I ever thought of, like, man, my parents can die. Like, I went from singing and dancing in this movie to, like, what just happened? Like, Simba's running around, and he's like, help, somebody, anybody. And I'm like, wow, that is so depressing. Like, it was just all downhill from there. And then Scar rolls up on him, and he's like, man, like, look what you did. And he's like, man, it was an accident. He's like, what would your mother say? Like, he's like filling Simba with all this, you know, condemnation and shame. And Simba's like, you know, like, what should I do? He's like, run away and never return. So that's what Simba does. He runs away, and he finds himself, like, in this desert. Like, I thought Simba was dead. Like, he ran so far, like, he ran till he couldn't run no more. And that's when we find, you know, Timon and Pumbaa. And they come up on him, and they're like, you know, they teach him about this new place. And he's eating new things, you know, becoming a new person. And they introduce him to Hakuna Matata. And they tell him, you know, it means don't worry. So Simba didn't have no worries in this new place. So he grows up, and we're like, okay, he's living a good little life. Years later, we see, you know, Nala comes back on the scene, and she's like, hey, man, you need to come back. You know, I'm glad you're alive. You know, you need to come back and be king. Like, that's your spot. And he like, no, like, you don't know what I did. Like, I can't go back there. So she's not convincing him at all to, like, come back. He's like, no, you know, I can't tell you the story, but I can't go back there. Like, I got a lot of past. So then we see Rafiki again. And he comes, and he's like being annoying. He's like all in Simba's face, and Simba like, man, who is you? And he's like, no, the question is, who are you? So Simba's like, you know what, like, I used to know, but I don't know no more. And he's like, I know who you are. You Mufasa's boy. And he's like, you know my father? And he's like, well, he said, you knew my father. And he's like, no, I know your father. So Simba's like, well, hate to tell you, but like he died. And he's like, no, he's alive. I'll show you. I'll take him to you. So at this point, you know, Simba's all excited. I'm excited. I'm like, man, has he been living another life all this time and I thought he was dead? So like we running through the woods, Simba gets flashed by, branches and stuff, and he comes and like Rafiki's like, stop, look down here. And I'm like, okay, Mufasa's about to be down here. He like shows him this like river, and he's like looking at his reflection, and he's like, man, that ain't my dad, that's just my reflection. And Rafiki is like, no, look on. And he's like, we see this transformation, and Mufasa comes out of the sky, and he's like, Simba, you have forgotten me. And Simba's like, nah, man, how can I forget you? And he's like, you've forgotten who you are, so you have forgotten me. So then he tells him that you must look inside yourself, Simba. You are more than what you have become. You must take your place in this great circle of life. And Simba's like, how can I go back? I'm not who I used to be. And Mufasa just says, remember who you are. You are my son, the one true king. Remember who you are. And then Simba, just crying and stuff like, no, don't leave me, don't leave me. Now that we spun up on the Lion King, today, I want you to keep that imagery in your head as we journey to the book of John, chapter 21, verses 15 through 19. When they had finished eating, Jesus said to Simon Peter, Simon, son of John, do you love me more than these? Yes, Lord, he said. You know I love you. Jesus said, feed my lambs. Again, Jesus said, Simon, son of John, do you love me? He answered, yes, Lord, you know I love you. Jesus said, take care of my sheep. The third time he said to him, Simon, son of John, do you love me? And Peter was hurt because Jesus asked him the third time, do you love me? And he said, Lord, you know all things. You know that I love you. And Jesus said, feed my sheep. Very truly I tell you, when you were younger, you dressed yourself and you went where you wanted. But when you are old, you would stretch out your hands and someone else would dress you and lead you to where you do not want to go. Jesus said this to indicate the kind of death by which Peter would glorify God. Then he said to him, follow me. The reading of the word. First things first, who is Peter? Anybody know who Peter is? One who denied Christ not once, not twice, but 3 times. Disciple. All right. You know a little bit. So notice in verse 15, Jesus is not referring to Peter as Peter. He says, Simon, son of John. At first when I got this text, I read past this. I was like, that ain't nothing important. Because honestly, when I get my text, I read through it, and then, about 10 times out of 10, I close my book or I throw my phone and say, you know what? That lady really don't like me. That lady is the Reverend Dr. Tracy. I'm like, I went through the internship. I feel like at this point, by now, I deserve an easy text. Like, I just don't get it. So, through my phone, through my Bible, I said, ain't nothing in this text making sense to me. Felt like the disciple, stuff was just going over my head. I'm like, yeah, I ain't got nothing for you. So, I had to pray fervently, came back to the text, and I'm like, okay, God, we're going to try this again. So I opened up my Bible, and Simon, son of John, just popped out to me. And I'm like, what is this? So then I realized that Jesus, in his mysterious way, is pointing out, trying to prove a point. You ever notice how your name changed based on, with people based on situations? I know as a kid you understand. Like for me, in my family, I go by Monique. But sometimes, my dad would call me and he'd be like, Saundra Anderson. Like first and last name, no Monique, nowhere to be found. And that's how I know that something ain't right in this relationship, but this is about to be a serious conversation. Or I do it, like the billion, I'd be like, I call him Billy Bob sometimes. If he in trouble, I'm like, Billion. Or I'd be like, hey, boy. You know, like, it ain't, you know, hey, sweetheart, you know, hey, Billy Bob, we ain't playing. Like, you know that something is different. You know, just like with your significant others, you know. Sometimes you notice how you go from bae or sweetheart to your first name. And Tony, what would you call her? You be like, the Reverend? Or you still call her Tracy? Doctor. You know something wrong when people start calling you by a name prior to what they now calling you. And that's how I felt like in this moment. Jesus is like, you know, Simon, son of John. He's not calling him by Peter. And I can be petty too. I do the same thing. I do it. Sometimes I like being petty. True fact. Now we go back to John 1 verses 42. I know y'all remember this. You know, Pastor Tracy preached this in 1994 when The Lion King came out. Now, for real, it was March 2021. I mean, 94, 21, almost the same. It's still a long time ago. That's how long we've been in the book of John. Andrew, Peter's brother, brings him to Jesus. And Jesus looks at him and he says, you are Simon, son of John. You will be called Cephas, which was translated as Peter. And our boy John, in his detailed fashion, is the only gospel that records this name change. Why is this important? Because Jesus looks at Peter and he tells him his past and his future all in the same breath. He didn't just change his name to some random name just to be calling him some short name or whatever. The Hebrew meaning for Cephas or Peter is rock. And Jesus in this moment gave him a purpose. See, Simon, son of John, was just a fisherman, but Peter is a fisher of men, is who he called him to be. So there's one person, but Simon, son of John, all he knows is being a fisherman. And when Jesus called him to be Peter, he gave him a purpose to be Peter, the rock, and to fish men. So he changed his occupation, changed his destiny. So Jesus takes Peter back to the beginning, no longer referencing him as Peter, which he called him. And if you remember last week, in the text, Peter went back to doing what he was doing before he met Jesus. And honestly, you know, he wasn't doing a good job. You know, he was still just catching seaweed. You know, he wasn't really catching no fish. So going back wasn't really a good thing. Like, he didn't waste no time. And until now, I didn't even understand that denial was more than just saying, like, I don't know you. You know, I used to take this text light and just be like, oh, Jesus, you know, he was in fear. And he was just like, man, I don't know him, like, just to try to get out of trouble. When really the word deny in Greek means to refuse to acknowledge someone's identity or even their existence. How can Peter be a disciple when he refused to acknowledge Jesus' identity or his existence? Deny means to renounce and to formally declare one's abandonment, to give up and resign by formal declaration. So Peter wasn't just saying, oh, I don't know him. Peter was saying, I formally declare my abandonment. I do not acknowledge his existence or his identity as Jesus or the Messiah, and don't associate me with this man. Like, Peter got so mad that in Matthew and Mark, they say that he began cursing and swearing with an oath. Like, Peter was mad. I was reading this text like, calm down now, Peter. Like, Peter was upset. Like, I don't know this man. Like, quit telling me that I know this man. So Peter, you know, the phrase when it says, you know, like, you're cursing and doing this oath. You ever heard the phrase of, if I'm lying, may God strike me down? You know, that used to hold something until Peter. You know, when Peter started saying it, like, he knew he was lying. So, you know, like now when people tell me, you know, on my mama, you know, on my life, I ain't lying. Or, you know, if God, you know, if I'm lying, may God strike me down. I just kind of take a step left because I know they like Peter, like they just lying, they just saying this because they mad, but they really, kind of lying. So Peter fell, and just like Simba, he finds himself in a place where the person he loved is now dead. And although it wasn't his fault, he had a part to play in it. So for 3 days, imagine Peter and how he may have felt. He looked at Jesus and realized what he did on that third denial, and he wept. Can you imagine that image in your head for 3 days, knowing that you was the one who was proudly professing, like, even if everyone else deserts you, I'll never desert you. And knowing that you did it 3 times, and on the third time, you actually looking this man in his face. Imagine holding that image for 3 days. And I can imagine the enemy, Peter feeling guilt and shame, condemnation, and maybe even hearing the voice of saying, what would Mary think? What would the disciples think if they know that you did this? Just like Simba, it's like, man, what is everybody going to think when they know that I did deny Christ? How can I go professing the word now knowing that I just said I don't even know this man? So what can he do besides run? Now in Matthew 16, Jesus was asking the disciples, who do people say I am? And then he asked the disciples, who do you say I am? And Peter answered him and said, you are the Messiah, the Son of the living God. And Jesus tells him, you are blessed, Simon, son of John, because my Father in heaven has revealed this to you. You did not learn this from any human being. Now I say to you, Peter, that you are Peter, which means rock, and upon this rock I will build my church, and all the powers of hell would not conquer it. And I will give you the keys to the kingdom of heaven. Yet again, we see him reference him as Simon, son of John, and the proclamation of Peter, who holds the keys to the kingdom. They're 2 different people. And like he continues to purposely let us know that he's not talking to Simon, son of John. Simon doesn't hold the same aspect as Peter. And he told Peter, on this rock, I will build my church. So he didn't call Simon, the fisherman, to do this task. He called that to Peter. But when Peter denied him, Peter went back to being something that God hadn't called him to be. So God can't fulfill that promise in his life by him going back to being something that he no longer called him to. It's like that scene in The Lion King where Mufasa brings Simba and he shows them all the land and he's like, everything the light touches is yours. Jesus did the same thing for Peter and told him, like, you hold the key to the kingdom. Everything is yours. But just like Simba ran away and all that was his was no longer his anymore because he chose to run, Peter did the same thing. And everything that he had access to, he lost. Not because Jesus took it away from him, but because he chose to run. When someone gives you the key to something that they own, that's usually a big deal. You don't give any and everybody a key to your house, a key to your car, a key to your heart, or your valuable assets. But Jesus is saying, I'm going to give you the key to my whole kingdom. Does anybody, have exes or something that still have access to your house? Access to your keys? People that you don't talk to still have access to call you. So when Peter denounced him, it's like, why would he still feel he's entitled to have access to this when you denounce me? So Jesus is like, I'm going to fix that for you because I still want this for you. So Jesus, just like we talked about in this reckless love, he's not holding it against Peter. He comes to Peter and he's like, I got to fix this for you. And Mark gets the kudos points for this because he's the only one that records this in his gospel. Mark says, you are looking for Jesus, but he is risen. Go tell the disciples and Peter. And I love this because a little bit of it was petty, you know. I'm petty, but this little bit I was like, that's a little petty to be like the disciples and Peter. But it was also profound that Jesus is saying, although you may say like you're not a disciple anymore, I'm still going to call you by name. You're still invited. I want you to know that I've risen too, because I still got a purpose for you. And he spent this time to restore Peter. So after he found him, you know, fishing or whatever, he called him back to have this conversation with him, asking him, do you love me? And he does this 3 times, just as many times as he denies him, in order to restore him. He didn't hold a shame or condemnation over him. He just says, hey, do you love me? And like Peter says, you know I love you. And Jesus invites him into, you know, not only just being a fisherman, he invites him to being a shepherd. He invites him to more. He never has a conversation of, or you remember what you did, or you remember you said you don't know me. He just brings his love and his acceptance. And he says, do you love me? And here's the task that I have for you. And he gives them that chance to reconcile that relationship. Who or what have you let run you away from your rightful place in the kingdom? Who have you let fill you with shame and guilt and condemnation? Have you forgotten the Father because you've forgotten yourself? You've forgotten who you are? 2023 years later, the gates of hell still has not prevailed the church, because Peter was that rock. Prophecy was fulfilled. And I think about the people that I know even here in this church who've told their stories of, well, I used to be able to work with the kids and someone ran me off. And Jesus is saying, do you love me? Teach my children. I think of people who said, I used to paint and I lost that passion, and Jesus is saying, do you love me? Paint the painting. Or people who used to play drums and people run you off, and Jesus says, do you love me? Play the drums. Sing the song. Be who you are. Jesus did not come into the world to condemn the world, but through him, the world may be saved. Jesus does not bring shame and condemnation, so whatever or whoever made you run, it's probably a scar in this situation. Somebody that's just pushing you away because they know that you are entitled to something and that you are great, and they're pushing you away to be something that you're not. I think of back in 2019 after I first visit here, and I was in that same place of feeling like, you know, people ran me away. People ran me away from the church. People ran me away from my family. And it's like, I vividly heard Jesus say to me, it's like, you got a good life as a soldier. And it's like, you're doing good. You got your own life, but I have something better for you. But will you trust me to the more? Because just like Simba, it's like, I have a good life, I'm doing good, but I wasn't doing what I was called to be. I forgot who God had called me to be. And I was just living life. Because like Simba, you know, like, real talk, where he was kind of looked better than Pride Rock. Even Timon and Pumbaa, like, we finna fight for this? So it don't mean that your life is bad, but are you living your life to the fullness of who you're called to be? Are you going by Simon, son of John, when God has called you to be a Peter? Because just like that, had Peter continued to be a fisherman, we wouldn't have the church now 2023 years later. If he would have continued to run from who God had called him to be. Your life is important. What you do is important. It impacts everyone. Just like this image of the circle of life, everyone has their own place in this circle of life. And what and who you are matters. Because had I just stayed in that place, I wouldn't be standing before you now, 4 years later, an elder and an ordained minister. Because people told me no, I ran from it. But just like Peter, God restored that relationship, and he called me, and I answered and said, yes, I love you. Yes, I will feed your sheep. So what is God calling you to? Will you return and claim your rightful place and receive your keys to the kingdom? Because everything the light touches is yours. But don't go to that shadowy place. You must never go there. God has not left us. Anytime you think that he is, you look in the mirror, and just like Rafiki said, he lives in you because he left the gift of the Holy Spirit to always live with us. So never feel like you're alone. Find your place in this great circle of life and remember who you are. Amen.